Hey folks, welcome back to our next chapter in the ongoing discussion of The Story by Randy Frazee. This time around, we are looking at chapter 16, which is entitled The Beginning of the End, parentheses, of the Kingdom of Israel, parentheses. The setting or the format for what we see this week is very similar to what we had in chapter 15 in the previous chapter. We have some narration mixed in with some prophetic writings, and honestly, I kind of like this because this is looking at a section of Israeli, that's not the right word, of biblical history, maybe is the better way of saying that, or the history of the Jewish culture, the Jewish nation, whatever we want to say, and also recognizing the importance of the various prophetic writings or the activity of the prophets within that portion of history. Now, the main thrust of what we look at this week, or in this chapter, I should say, is looking at the fall of the northern kingdom, aka Israel, aka Samaria, and also I realized this in a little bit of my work and research this week, on occasion known as Ephraim. Ephraim was one of the other tribes of Israel, one of the 12 tribes, and is kind of considered to be the largest one after the kingdom of Judah, and definitely the largest one, I said that wrong, the largest one after the tribe of Judah, and the largest tribe within the northern kingdom of Israel. So occasionally within prophetic writings, you will see or hear it just referred to as Ephraim, and that's kind of a similar situation there. Some of the other things that we hear about, we hear of some of the threats towards the southern kingdom of Judah. All of this really zeroes in on the effect of the Assyrian Empire among that area at this portion of history. Scripturally, where we're looking at, we have some aspects that are taken out of 2 Kings, late in 2 Kings, starting at about chapter 17. And then also we have aspects from the prophetic writings of the book of Isaiah. So that's really where our various passages that we have featured in this chapter come from. A quick word on Isaiah. I'm going to come back to Isaiah in a bit, but a quick word on Isaiah. Longest of the prophetic writings, it's over 60 chapters long. Many scholars agree that what we know as Isaiah as a whole is very likely the work or the writings of 3 different individuals that were kind of spaced out over the course of quite a few decades. It is possible that they were all written by the same individual who was just rather long lasting. I'm not saying that's outside the realm of possibility, but it is considered and pretty widely accepted that there were probably multiple individuals who were active at different times, and that was all condensed together into what we know as Isaiah as a whole. We'll come back to Isaiah. Big theme within this chapter, and it's going to carry forward into the next, at least the next chapter as well, is the idea of exile. This is very, very common within this section of biblical history. Now, we've talked about the idea before that kingdoms tended to be as large as the king was strong enough to hold on to. At this point, though, we begin to see the existence of various empires, or the rise of various empires, though this is not entirely new. Egypt was an empire, and at times even Israel, the United Kingdom, could be considered an empire or a superpower, I've called that. Like under David and under Solomon, definitely that was the case. But we see these larger kingdoms really morphing into what we know as empires. Now, Assyrian Empire is really the one that's most pressing and most important within this particular chapter. Their power and control continues to build and spread, and this begins to affect Israel as a whole, both kingdoms, but really the northern kingdom. One way to avoid destruction if you were a kingdom and there was a larger, more powerful one neighboring you or threatening you was to become what is known as a vassal state or a vassal kingdom, which is essentially paying tribute to this larger, powerful, more powerful empire so that they'll leave you alone, or maybe they will offer you aid or even offer you protection, giving the case. Now, at this point in history, Hosea is the king of the northern kingdom of Israel, and he had been a vassal of Assyria. as they grew in prestige, but he switches his allegiance to Egypt, and Assyria gets wind of it, and they are not real happy about it. This leads to a 3-year siege. Now, I don't exactly know where that siege was, probably whatever would be considered the capital of the Northern Kingdom at the time. I doubt that they laid siege to the entire nation, because that's a lot of space. But they laid siege that lasted for 3 years. Eventually, they conquered Israel. And we have the first evidence of exile, or the first exile within the history of the Holy Land. And this is known as the Assyrian exile of the Northern Kingdom of Israel. Now, what this looked like, the conquering people, the conquering empire, oftentimes the conquering military, would take a lot of the important folks, like the upper echelon of society, think the nobles, think military people, things of that nature, and they either killed them or they hauled them off to somewhere else, leaving some folks behind, not all, but leaving some folks behind, and then importing people from other conquered people from around the empire, other people that they have conquered. You move them away from their homeland and into an area that is unfamiliar and let them settle amongst people that they're unfamiliar with. And if you are one of the people who happen to remain where you were, you've got all these other folks coming in and intermingling and intermixing, and it leads to a lot of basically confusion and lack of solidarity, because you've got all these different cultural aspects kind of mingling and mixing in together, and it can be really, really, really difficult. And that's a great, great control tactic on the part of the empire. So this happens within the Northern Kingdom of Israel. And it occurred historically in the year 722 BC, so about 725 years before Jesus was around. Now, from what we know, those individuals who were hauled off in the Assyrian exile never came back. It is possible throughout history that some of their descendants may have made it back to the whole, what we would call the Holy Land, or back to the Promised Land, or back to Israel, or that area as history continued. But those who were carried off from the Northern Kingdom never really came back. And the ongoing history of the folks who came in to the Northern Kingdom and stayed and intermingled with the folks who were there, that leads to the individuals we know as the Samaritans when we get to the New Testament, and which we've mentioned before, but that's kind of where all that comes from. Over the course of the next roughly 120 to 140 years, the Babylonian Empire arose, and we have a similar situation happen within the southern kingdom of Judah, which fell to Babylon in the year 586 BC. Again, that's a preview of next chapter when we get into chapter 17. So I'm not going to give a whole ton of that there, but we do think, or a lot of scholars do think, that at least a healthy portion of the book of Isaiah really kind of takes place in and around this whole Babylonian situation rather than the early Assyrian situation. So that's kind of, we sort of have aspects from picking and choosing from some different points within a larger chunk of history, but from within different portions of that larger chunk. Coming back around now to Isaiah, and I'm also with that going to kind of jump into the things that make Pastor Scott go, Sometimes I call them problematic, but whatever we're going to say. The final bit that we have within this chapter and within Isaiah's writings is something that's known as the passages referring to the suffering Messiah. And that text may sound familiar. It is oftentimes referenced within Christian circles and is used to point towards Jesus. And I think that's okay, but we need to be careful with that. There is a topic or an idea that is called supersessionalism. And this refers to the practice of taking Jewish or Hebrew aspects of faith, including what we call the Old Testament, or sometimes we call them the Hebrew Scriptures, and applying Christian viewpoints to them. More specifically, the idea that the Christian worldview or the Christian faith view trumps the Jewish sensibility. And I bring this up because it's important to note that Isaiah was not writing directly about Jesus. Namely, the individual known as Isaiah was not writing, centuries previous, like in 800 years, an individual named Jesus is going to be born, and this is who this is that I'm writing about. Uh, I'm trying to think how to say this. It's basically what I'm trying to say is it's important that we remember that the authors of the various Hebrew scriptures did not have Christianity in mind when they were writing them. Now, that being said, we bring a Christian lens or a Jesus lens, if we want to say that, to a lot of what we read within what we call the Old Testament. And this is not a bad thing to do. It is okay for our view to have that Jesus lens. It's not a bad thing, but we need to remember that distinction. Yes, there are correlations between some of the things that we find within the Old Testament and the way we understand things with Jesus. We can make those connections, but those connections are not necessarily implied by the original folks who were writing them down. That's the distinction that I want you to remember. That essentially, I think what I'm trying to say is that Judaism does not exist to simply be the forerunner to be perfected by Jesus. And maybe it's kind of odd hearing that coming from a pastor, a Christian pastor, but I think it's important to remember that the Jewish writings, Jewish faith is separate from Christianity. Even though we share some aspects, they are still two separate things. So that's really everything that I have. I know within your discussion this week, you're going to be looking at a couple of chapters that are tied fairly closely together. I hope you have a great discussion, and we will be back with our next time.